2022. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For those on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. We have here the Honourable Minister François-Philippe Champagne, who is accompanied by Simon Kennedy, Deputy Minister, Eric Dagenet, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, and Mark Shan, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister. And for the second hour, colleagues, we will have Tony Staffieri, President and Chief Executive Officer of Rogers, and Ron McKenzie, Chief Technology and Information Order. And without further ado, I invite the Minister to take the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and colleagues. We are here today because on July 8th, something unacceptable happened in our country. I know that each and every one of you heard countless stories from frustrated constituents who were impacted by the Rogers outage on July 8th. I know I did. The Rogers outage concerned all Canadians and not only the company's more than 12 million clients who were directly impacted. As I've already said many times, this was unacceptable. Full stop. Canadians rightfully deserve answers.
It's so important for me to come before this committee today. Because let's remember, during the outage, millions of Canadians were without cell phone and internet access for more than 15 hours. Hundreds of thousands, literally, of businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, had to turn customers away because they were unable to use Interac to complete transactions. Government departments lost the ability to provide services to Canadians. And most worrisome, countless Canadians lost the ability to call 911. Again, this is simply unacceptable, full stop. That is the message I conveyed to Tony Staffieri, the CEO of Rogers, on multiple occasions since the 8th of July. I used my voice to amplify the voice of millions of Canadians and expressed in no uncertain terms their frustration with this unprecedented outage in our country. Mr. Staffieri has acknowledged that Rogers has broken the public's trust and agree on taking a series of action to address this matter promptly and decisively. While the responsibility for the outage rests solely with Rogers, we now have to be in solution mode. And that's the attitude I have adopted since the very first hours of this outage. I was informed of the outage by my team late afternoon on July 8th, Tokyo time, very early morning, July 8th, here in Ottawa, as I was wrapping up a week-long mission to Japan. A few hours later, I received an update indicating that the outage now seemed more serious than originally anticipated. I immediately picked up the phone, not only to contact the CEO of Rogers, but also the CEOs of TELUS and Bell to see how they could possibly help. As soon as I landed back in Canada the next day, I convened a meeting with the CEO of Rogers, TELUS, Bell, Videotron, Shaw, SaskTel, and Eastlink, directing them to take immediate action to improve network resiliency and reliability across Canada. As a first step, I demanded within 60 days, the companies enter into a formal binding agreement, ensuring and guaranteeing three things: emergency rooming, mutual assistance, and a communication protocol for advising the public and government on major outages and other emergencies. Folks, the clock is ticking, and there's 45 days left to deliver on that commitment. In a similar fashion, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission adopted measures to improve network resiliency recently on the 6th of July. As you know, the CRTC is also conducting a detailed investigation of the outage, including the measures that Rogers is putting in place to prevent similar outages. I have also directed the Canadian Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee to develop additional proposals to improve network resiliency. On the basis of their findings, and as I said from the outset, we will consider more measures to have the network resiliency that Canadian deserves. En conclusion, tous les Canadiens méritent.
In closing, let me say this. All Canadians deserve to have affordable, resilient communication services. And this is why telecommunication services providers should be better prepared to deal with future outages. We also have to hold these providers accountable, and we will do so on behalf of Canadians. Allow me to say this. Some will see here the opportunity to deal with issues having to do with telecommunications, with competition, with the proposed merger of Rogers and Shaw, and other connected questions. But I believe Canadians who are listening to us want two very precise things. They want to know what happened July 8th, and they want to know what solutions will make sure that this does not happen again. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will be pleased to answer questions. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. So with the first round of questions, I will give Mr. Généreux the floor. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Minister, you're quite right. We have all kinds of questions about this event, but I will deal with what you suggested yourself. There were 5 businesses that you had to communicate with, and they represent 95% of the industry. Do you think that what happened showed that there aren't that many players who are serving Canadians? First of all, Mr. Généreux, thank you for your question. It was clear to us that competition promotes resilience. And this is an issue that I've talked about before. I've also talked about innovation and competitiveness. But the first thing I did when I talked to the CEO of Rogers was to say how frustrated these 12 million Canadians were and how frustrated the hundreds of thousands of businesses who were hurt. And I demanded immediate action to improve resilience across the country. And I asked the telecos to come to a formal agreement. There was an arrangement before, an arrangement for mutual assistance. There's also roaming, emergency roaming. And we wanted a better communications protocol for Canadians because with respect to that, I expressed the frustration of Canadians during this outage, which was unprecedented. Well, Mr. Minister, we know that 95% of the Canadian population is served by these 5 companies. So the resilience that you're talking about is, I don't know, it's really not there if a third of the country or almost can't communicate. And this agreement or contract you're talking about would require that these businesses communicate among one another. And they all have different priorities. How can you assure us that these businesses, or what assurances did these businesses give you when you were talking to Bell, TELUS, Videotron, etc.? Do they consider themselves to be at the same level in terms of competitiveness? What assurance did they give you that in 45 days, when this agreement is due, do you have their assurance that they will do this? Mr. Généreux, when I talked to the CEOs of the various companies, they were extremely serious, as I was. I demanded that they come to a formal agreement to do three very precise, very specific things. An arrangement for mutual assistance. I want this to be codified in writing. I want it to be formal. And also emergency roaming be codified. And that there be a communications protocol with the government, but also with customers. We're not just looking at intentions, we're looking at obligations. Minister, please allow me to be a bit skeptical. When we're talking about something this important, you're talking about the 60-day period, but I have to say I'm skeptical. You're talking about obligations. But what penalty would be provided for? What would happen to these businesses if they don't come to an agreement? Well, first of all, as a regulator, these telecos, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology has an undertaking from the CEOs of these companies that there will be an agreement. And I wasn't asking for opinions. What I asked for was formal. I think we had the CEO. You'll be talking to the CEO from Rogers. He can tell you. There's also another organization, the Canadian Telecommunications Resilience Group, which is chaired by Éric Dagenet, who was one of our officials. And they've been told that this will happen in the next 45 days. When I called them, I asked them to show up on Monday, and everyone is showing up, and they're in resolution mode. And I think the fact that we experienced this kind of unacceptable event, well, I'll be clear. This is only a beginning. I will demand even more from them, and we will investigate with the CRTC. There will be recommendations, and following that, I will demand additional measures. But for the time being, the CEOs of the various companies have agreed with me that more has to be done to increase the resilience of these networks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Minister, so good to see you. It's been a while. Thank you very much for coming to the committee. I woke up on July 8th and couldn't get any of my device working. And like many Canadians, my family entered this bundle service for more than 20 years with Rogers. So it caused a bit of panic. And luckily, one of my work phone was served by Bell. So I learned from social media, reported by all these news outlets, that there is a massive outage. But there wasn't any communication until we get closer to noon from Rogers. So as Rogers customer, we all want to know what happened, when it's going to be returned, the service. So you act very quickly on that weekend, reaching out to Rogers. But before you reached out, was there any proactive measures done from on Rogers' side to explain to you, as the head of the department, what's going on, what's happening?
Well, thank you very much, MP Dong, and it's great to see you again, my friend, as well. As you know, I was wrapping up a mission in Japan as the events unfolded. So with the time difference, I was made aware of the initial issue that we had with the network of Rogers. When it was indicating that the matter was more serious, I immediately, I think it was the very early hours in Tokyo, if I recall, around 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, that I was made aware it was more serious, at which point I did reach out immediately to Tony Staffieri, the CEO of Rogers. Obviously, he understood the seriousness of the situation and the obligation he had to inform the Minister of Industry of the situation. On that call, I was first inquiring about what was the network situation, how long it would take, and obviously at this moment expressing the frustration of millions of Canadians, but also be on solution mode. When you have a crisis of that nature, which is unprecedented, I immediately, after that call, reached out to the CEO of Bell, the CEO of TELUS. Everyone offered their assistance. The Canadian Telecom Resilience Working Group was also called upon to make sure that an update was provided by Rogers. But I would say, MP Dong, what is my takeaway from what happened? And this is why I have demanded, I did not ask, I demanded from the telecom companies in Canada three things, as I landed back a few hours later in Canada. First, I convened them in a meeting. But I did three things, which was, first, I wanted to formalize the mutual assistance agreement. I knew that some form of informal mutual assistance existed between the network, but I said, this is not good enough for Canadians. Now you need to enter into a binding formal agreement to include that. The second thing was emergency rooming, and that is quite similar to what the Federal Telecommunication Commissions did in the United States just recently on the 6th of July. But I went beyond that, MP Dong, to address exactly what you said, is that they failed to inform the Canadian public properly. They failed to inform the government of Canada properly. It should not be to the Minister of Industry to reach out to the CEO of Rogers. It should be the other way around.
Point, Minister.
It should be the other way around.
Exactly, because the waiting period is creating a lot of not just frustration, but it had the potential of creating chaos. A lot of people was guessing that what's going on, is there a cyber attack on Canada? You said it. You first learned this 4 or 5 o'clock here in the afternoon in Toronto time, or Ottawa time. But when did you first talk to the CEO of Rogers?
Well, let's make sure we don't confuse the time zone, because let's remember, MP Dong, I was in Tokyo at that moment. So when I said 4 or 5 was 4 or 5 a.m. Tokyo time. So this was really still pretty much either early morning for me in Tokyo, so one would have to work back. But I immediately called Tony Staffieri, and to your point, if I may, MP Dong, you're exactly the point that I made to them. It should not be to the minister to chase the CEO of a major telco in Canada when something like that happened. It should rather be the other way around. And that's why I've insisted in these 3 points that I've noted that I want a formal agreement. I insisted that we have a communication protocol, first with the public, because the public are entitled to know what's going on, and secondly with the government of Canada to make sure that when any such thing happened, there'd be a better communication channel. I must say that since this happened, the CEO of Rogers have reached out to me to update me regularly, and I think we already see improvements in that respect, but this needs to be codified, and that's what the formal binding agreement will be doing.
Well, this is not the first time. As recent as 2021, they had the regional outage as well. And at the time, the CEO said this, we'll do things to make sure this doesn't happen again. And sure enough, less than 2 years, this is happening. So what gives you the confidence that with all these additional measures that you mentioned, that it's actually going to change the industry and making sure that the Canadians don't suffer in a future event like this? Because by their explanation, it's quite routine, all these updates, right? So it could happen again.
Yeah, this was Rogers' failure. Let's be clear. This is a failure by one company. But to your point, I agree with you. And that's why from the get-go, you may recall, MP Dong, not only I spoke to the CEO of Rogers, the CEO of Bell, TELUS, then a broader network, but I also went to the public, to the media, and explained the situation. And I said at the time, very openly and very clearly, that I expressed my frustration, that I'd say this is unacceptable, and that we need to implement immediate action. I immediately said as well that these would be initial steps. And that's why I think the work of this committee is so crucial, and the work of the CRTC to understand the root cause. Now, the facts as we understand them, this was a coding error in a routine update. Now it posed the question, how could this ever happen? What kind of system needs to be put in place? What kind of review needs to be put in place? And that is a bit like with an air disaster investigation. You need to take the time to go to the root cause. Once we understand better the chain of events and what failed at Rogers, we will obviously make sure that we take additional steps to close that gap. And I've been very clear to the CEOs that I will demand more of them. But that was the initial steps, I would say, hours within the outage.
Thank you, Minister. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur Lemire pour 6 minutes.
No, Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Minister. So you asked for a meeting with the various competitors of Rogers and the Competition Bureau, and you're talking about the failure of Rogers. Had you talked to Rogers? I know there was a technical briefing. How did this happen? How did this proceed? Well, first of all, Mr. Lemire, it's a pleasure to see you, and I'd like to say that the calls I made were to the CEOs of the various telecommunications companies. The CRTC was not part of this. I saw from the very first discussion I had with the CEO of Rogers that, well, he informed me shortly after the outage, we were still wondering if we had been victims of a cyber attack, but the CEO informed me of the findings of their internal investigation. They were able to identify the cause of the outage, and they knew how to get the system working again as soon as possible. And after that, there was a call with the other CEOs of these telcos in Canada, and that's how it proceeded. What did Rogers tell you about their progress and how they were going to act to deal with this? Well, it was the CEO of Rogers, Mr. Tony Staffieri, who will be a witness as well. I communicated with him. Same thing with the other companies. It was with their CEOs. How much trust do you have in the governance system at Rogers? It seems that they were dealing with things in a rather cavalier way over the past few months. But what do you think of the state of Rogers right now, especially with respect to a possible merger? Well, when I talked to the CEO, I said three things. I expressed the frustration of millions of Canadians, of hundreds of thousands of small businesses, and I also expressed the frustration of people who are first responders all over Canada. So I was very clear with him that this was unacceptable, full stop, and that I wanted corrective measures brought in immediately, that I wanted an investigation into this matter, and that when appropriate, we wanted additional measures to have a network that's more resilient. And it's clear, and I express this publicly, that everything that happened will remain, in my opinion and in the opinions of others, will remain something that shows the necessity of a resilient system. How robust do you think the plan is of these companies? Well, what I did, Mr. Lemire, was to impose three things. I wanted a formal contract for mutual assistance, then emergency roaming, and then better services to citizens. This was a requirement that I expressed. And a few hours later, when the system was restored, I said we have to urgently make sure that there is true resilience. Now, this is why the committee's work is important. We want to get to the bottom of things and see that if there was an error in the coding in this routine update, how did this happen? What mistakes were made? How did this happen? What are the redundancies available? So I not only intend to do more, but with C26, as you'll remember, we introduced C26 to give additional powers in terms of cybersecurity, and I intend to use these powers to ensure better resiliency. What were the reactions of Rogers' competitors? Aren't you muzzling a competition from at the base? Because it seems that no need to invest more. Because if we invest more, because if we make mistakes, the others will save us. Well, that's not it, Mr. Lemire. When I talked to the CEOs, my voice represented millions of Canadians, and you'll understand that when we talk on behalf of millions of Canadians, people tend to listen. I express myself very clearly, directly. There was no margin for error or for misinterpretation in my message. I gave them 60 days. Now they have 45 days left of those 60 days. They all undertook to do what I asked them to do. But it's a race to the top. What we want to do is to make sure that everyone is more resilient, because, Mr. Lemire, it was the fault of one company, and that company has to account for what happened. But we want more resiliency all over. On July 6th in the United States, they were talking about this. They want more resiliency in their system, and we want it in Canada. Thank you. Now, Mr. Moss, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. One of the things that is concerning about this is that, the strategy that you employed probably commands the respect you deserve from the legislation. That's almost none. Because the legislation we have to kind of put some oversight is different than other communities and other countries. Good example is Australia. They actually control their actual system, and the actual industry competes amongst the system. I think that obviously this is an essential service. COVID proved that our connections are essential in terms of our operations. So what I'm looking for is, what is the government going to do to actually restore this as an essential service and put some legislative teeth behind this issue? It's similar to like a public utility. If not, then we have to rely upon any minister being buddy-buddy with a bunch of CEOs who are also getting a lot of handouts from the public at any point in time for accountability. I don't find that enough. What legislative measures are you going to take to actually have more command and respect from the industry, regardless of who is in the CEO seat and who's in the minister's seat?
I would say, with respect to MP Massé, this is not about us talking, in a sense, the minister with the CEO. This is demanding. And I wish you would have been on that call, because you would have said this was no time for challenging the Minister of Industry. I was talking on behalf of millions of Canadians. And let me just say 3 things we've done on the legislative side that will add to what we've been doing. The first thing, you will recall very vividly, that we decided in May to provide more resiliency, to exclude our intention to exclude ZTE and Huawei from our 4 and 5G network. We introduced Bill C-26 on June 14, which will do 2 things. But
those won't affect this. That's public safety. Okay. I only have limited time.
Well, yeah, but I would say Bill C-26, you're right, that will promote cybersecurity, but we'll do one important thing with respect, sir. It will amend the Telecom Act to add security as an objective, which will give additional power to the minister if he needs to use to direct the company. And we also have the new CRTC policy direction. I would say, sir, if you were at that meeting, you will say I was not in a mood to listen to them. This was a directive that I issued to them, and they complied immediately with what I demanded.
Why not a telecom bill of rights? Why don't we just get on with this and protect consumers, to protect other businesses, protect people that are even suffered from public safety issues altogether with a telecom bill of rights? Why not just move forward past this?
Listen, as I said, you will recall, MP Massé, that the first thing that I did, even when I was in Tokyo, was to hold them to account on behalf of Canadians. I said to them that we would take initial steps, the 3 things I mentioned, in a binding legal agreement, that they'll have to do mutual assistance. They will have to do emergency roaming. This is very much in line with what the U.S. did on 6th of July. But I went beyond and say I want to have a framework, a very clear protocol to inform the public and their customers and the government if this happened. The other thing I said, you will recall probably, I said, this is just initial steps. That's why I welcome your work, the work of the committee, to say, let's go to the root cause of that. Let's look at what more we need. We all want, as Canadians, more resiliency. I've said this is unacceptable from the get-go, and we'll be looking at everything we can do to improve resiliency.
Well, I hope that if you're going to look towards the committee, you could also look towards the committee that is not fooling around with the Shaw-Rogers takeover. And we've already been spoken about that, opposed to it. And I don't know why we're still fooling around with that, but hopefully you'll take that seriously back, as we should be moving on from that. But right now, under the legislation, what penalty will Rogers, either CEO, staff, or whoever, will they pay? The company pay a fine? Will anyone go to jail? Will there be any problems or repercussions? What actually protects consumers? Rogers is doing a refund to some customers. What actually is in the legislation that actually mandates certain specifics? Are those things going to happen? They're not going to happen from my understanding of the legislation. And if I'm wrong, then let us know. And if not, are you going to actually employ those things that are actually going to be in law, not just a minister's opinion to the actual industry?
Yeah, well, it's more than an opinion, it's a directive. You know, when I speak to them, they listen. That's bottom line.
They don't have to follow, though.
Well, listen, they do. They do. Trust me, they do. When the Minister of Industry speak to them, they do. Ask them to testify.
They didn't even call you.
No, but when I demanded that they put these measures, that's why we're rectifying, as I say, MP Massa, is that now we're going to have that. We'll have C26. But in addition to that, we're all on the same side. I spoke on behalf of 12 million Canadians. So I said, listen, this is what we demand now. The CRTC, to your point, sir, let me just finish. The CRTC will be investigating, and they will be asking these questions about refund. I said publicly the first day, I said, I expect and demand that Rogers compensate people fairly and proactively. I said that from the get-go.
Okay, so but if you want to be on the same side here, we actually need, instead of just a minister's opinion, which change. We've had Minister Bernier in that seat before, and I've actually seen the policies not change that different over the last number of different years. I'm on the side of Canadians that want, regardless of whoever minister is going to be there, there's going to be accountability to the public through their own individual strength and worth as a citizen, not necessarily relying upon egos or people that are going to change seats at the CEO table. Those things are all things that we can't control. What we can control is a legislative process, as an essential service that's like a public utility that strengthens the individual and collective rights of Canadians. That's the side I want you to be on. I don't want to be on the side where we have to rely upon influence and goodwill and personal elections and whether they're golfing with somebody or not. These are the things that I don't want to rely on. I want to rely on legislation.
Well, you'll be able to rely on a binding formal agreement, sir, for the first three things that I mentioned. This is going to be a formal binding agreement. This is not like, the way you describe it seems like it's no, this is, I demanded. There's no discussion. It's going to be done. There's no room for maneuver. The second thing I would say, sir, with respect, I think on C26, and I think because you're a very experienced legislator, amending the Telecom Act to add security to it will give additional power to the minister. Not only, like you said, that they will follow what I said, but that if you support C26 with colleague, I would have legal power to demand that, because once you add security to the objective of the Telecom Act, that would give broad power to the ministers to do what I did. Now they did it. I demanded it. They're going to do it. We're going to do more. And with C26, I think that you and I, with the colleagues, will be able to better protect the public.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Mr. Massé. We'll now move to MP Gray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today.
Good morning.
Minister, I understand the CRTC, as the regulator, has a mandate to, quote, ensure Canadians can access emergency communication services. We make sure that Canadians can access services such as 911 and are warned through a public alerting system in the event of imminent perils. Do you believe the CRTC is fulfilling this mandate?
Well, certainly that's part of the mandate of the CRTC, and as we've seen with the recent event of Rogers, that was unacceptable. I saw a statement by the CEO of Rogers over the weekend that said that they have been looking at providing additional resiliency on 911. That's something I think, MP Gray, we should be looking at as a committee. That's certainly something which is top of mind with my colleague, the Minister of Public Safety. And that's part of the emergency roaming that we've been looking to make sure that we have more resiliency when it comes particularly to emergency services.
Thank you, Minister. This was a yes or no question, so I'll add on to that. Is there accountability? So we've now had the outage in 2021 and then this one in July of 2022. Do you believe that senior executives of a regulator should receive bonuses or remain in their roles if they're not meeting their mandate?
Well, I think what senior executives should do is to do their job and investigate what happened with the outage of Rogers. Millions of Canadians have been frustration. I've been their voice all along that to push the telecom companies in Canada to do more with respect to resiliency, and I expect them to do a full investigation. As you know, CRDC is independent from my department, but I expect them to do a full investigation, come with recommendations, and we will be demanding additional measures from these telco
Thank you, Minister.
companies.
Well, I mean, this is pretty clear cut. They're either fulfilling their mandate or they're not. So the CRTC is the regulator of telecommunications. Do they conduct regular operational risk assessments of the telecoms?
I think they should do, and you should have that question from the chair of the CRTC, which I understand will be a witness at the committee, as I understand it, in the coming hours or days.
Well, I guess if that's the case, there was an outage back in 2021. So did you take actions or give directives after the 2021 outage?
The civil service would have looked into that, but I would say the nature of the 2021 outage was nothing compared to what we have seen in the last few days, which certainly was something that first of all, this was the failure of one company. This is the failure of Rogers. They have acknowledged that and then acknowledged that they lost public trust in that. But what we need to do together, MP Gray, is to make sure as parliamentarian and me as minister that we have more resilience. And that's why I took immediate action with the 3 steps.
So thank you, Minister. Well, Minister, you're responsible for this area, and there were 911 outages also out in 2021. So the question is, did you yourself take any action? Did you call a meeting with the telecoms? Did you give any directives at that time? Like I said, what we've seen before is nothing like we've seen today. There's been a lot of work with respect to 911. We all understand this is essential for Canadians, and that's why that's one of the things I expressed frustrations. You will recall when I was in front of the media, I said I expressed the frustration, and I am pleased to see what Rogers has been saying over the weekend. This is top of mind, and this was top of mind when I conveyed the CEOs to say on behalf of Canadians and all of you as parliamentarian that this was unacceptable. Right. So basically what you're saying is after the 2021, you had not taken any actions or done any directives. You did say that the CRTC did some work. So at that time, did you ask for a report back from the CRTC then after the 2021 outage? I would disagree with the characterization that you made. What I said very specifically, and the record will show it, is that 2021 is nothing that we have experienced now. We've been, the department and the CRDC has been looking at 911 for a number of months. What we want now and what we've seen with the recent outage is that we need more resiliency. That's exactly what I demanded from the telcos now. And like I said, I am pleased to see that the CEO of Rogers has said over the weekend that they're working actively on that, and we will continue. We made spectrum available for 911. We made sure that we do everything we can from our side. The CRTC needs to do their job. We did ours. They need to do theirs. And as parliamentarians, we need to hold people to account. Minister, going back to my first question, if they're not doing their job, then they're not fulfilling their mandate, because we've had twice in just over a year when 911 services have gone down. So once again, do you believe that CRTC is not fulfilling their mandate? And if so, what are you prepared to do about it? Listen, I will uphold the highest standard on behalf of all Canadians when it comes to everyone in the public service doing their job. What I would suggest, MP Gray, with respect, would be, I think you have assigned the chair of the CRDC. They should be answering for their own action. As you know, they're independent from my department. But I was the first one to call on them to investigate. So I think you should take comfort in the fact that this minister has taken action. You're the minister. You're the minister. You're ultimately responsible, Minister. But the CRTC is independent, MP Gray.
Thank you,
Go to
Minister.
the legislation.
The time is up. We'll now move to MP Gahir for 5 minutes.
I can hear the question, Mr. Chair.
Yes, I think you're on mute, MP Gahir. Or it could be on your headset.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I certainly can, sir.
Sorry about that. Minister, it's great to see you.
Very good to see you, my friend.
Minister, during your July 11th meeting with Rogers and other major telecom providers, you instructed them to work together on a plan that includes collaboration on emergency roaming, assistance during outages, and a communications protocol to better inform the public and authorities during emergencies. So how did the other major telecom providers respond to your request for collaboration? Is there a sense of mutual responsibility to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Well, I'd say I was in no mood to get a lot of comments. This was really directing them to take steps. Like you said, I was expressing the frustration of millions of Canadians. I said this outage was unacceptable. As the colleague MP Gray said before, I at that time also said that there should be a CRTC investigation of that. And although this was Rogers' failure, let's be clear, this is one company's failure when they did coding in what we understand is a routine update. What I can say to you and to the member of the committee is that when I talked to the CEO of Bell and TELUS, everyone was in solution mode to try to see, as the crisis was evolving, what can they do to help with respect to staff, with respect to experts, with respect to network. And I understand from the CEO of Rogers, whom I think you're going to have as witness, they even enlisted international experts, their vendors internationally, to get to the bottom of that. This was deep in the system as they explained it to me. And so that's why not only I was pleased to see that there was this level of willingness to help, but I want that to be codified in a legally binding agreement. So that's why mutual assistance will be part of that agreement, emergency roaming, and a communication protocol with the government and the public.
Great, thank you. So you said that your instructions for collaboration were just the first step, and we've talked about the charter. What do you see as the next steps for telecom providers to remain accountable to Canadians?
Well, first of all, I think the communication, and I would invite you as member of the committees to see, you're going to have Rogers executive coming. I think their communication with the public was one thing. I think the Canadian public deserve better answers when something like that happened, and I would say government officials as well. And I was very clear in that meeting that this was only the first steps, that there would be more steps needed, but we need to go to the root cause. You know, it's a bit like with an air incident investigation. You need to go to the root cause to understand what really happened, what were the fail-safe measures, what was the review process, who was involved, trying to better understand. So with that body of evidence and recommendation coming from the CRTC, as MP Gray said, the CRTC will be investigating. We will be taking these recommendations, and I told them that I am going to be looking at them and will likely be demanding additional steps to be taken to improve the resiliency of the network in Canada.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to go off a point that a previous MP made. There were some media outlets that have said that the outage has proved that telecommunications networks should be considered as public utilities rather than being owned and operated by the private sector because they provide critical digital infrastructure for Canadians. So what do you think about this statement, and do you think we should reconsider the way that telecommunications networks are managed in Canada?
Well, my first order of priority, as you would appreciate, MP Guerrier, is to improve the resiliency of the network. You know, when I saw that happening, first was to understand what happened. Secondly, to make sure that all resources would be put to restore the network as quickly as possible. Thirdly, was to take immediate action to make sure that we would improve the resiliency. Fourthly, to have a thorough investigation, because you need to go and understand what really happened. And fifth, I would say, you know, it's to look at additional measures. I heard what you said, and I think MP Massey mentioned something similar. You know, for now, my concern is to really understand what really happened. And I think you need to do that. That's the logical next step. And once we have the findings and understand what really happened, what was the cause of this unacceptable failure of Canadians in our network, what are the appropriate steps? Like I said, what we've done is largely similar to what the U.S. have done on 6th of July with respect to network resiliency. But I'm prepared to go further as we look into that. And as the committee and the very valuable work you'll be doing with colleagues, any recommendation you would have, I will certainly look at them with a lot of interest.
Great. I look forward to it. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, sir.
Merci beaucoup. La parole est à Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes 30.
Mr. Lemire? Thank you, Chair. Minister, We know that Rogers is going to be spending $26 billion to buy Shaw. Now, you're talking about how important it is to increase network resiliency so that it be affordable and resilient. Now, for me, we're talking about the cell phone market. If these companies are truly accountable, they will invest more to have a more robust system. Thank you, Mr. Lemire, for your question. I said that competitiveness and competition was important for resiliency. Over the weekend, there was a communication from the CEO of Rogers who talked about additional investments to make the network more resilient. But as I said earlier, this is the fault of one company, and we have to understand what happened in that specific case and learn from it. And we have to be more resilient across the country. We have to look into what others are doing. What did Rogers do? What are others doing? And we also want to look at this proposed merger. I will not allow this to be done without being looked into. In my mind and in the mind of other regulatory organizations, when there is a proposal that is submitted to my department for a decision, well, we'll look into it. Well, did you question Rogers about a redundant system or something that would click into place if there was a failure? Well, Mr. Lemire, C26 will give the Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology additional powers to do something very important. It will allow us to adjust for security. Right now, it's not part of the objectives because this bill was drafted well before this outage. But it would be a good thing to make sure that there's more more robust and resilient network. Thank you.
Chair, and thanks again, Mr. Minister.
Thank you, sir.
Are you going to wait for the Competition Bureau in the report before taking action on the Rogers-Shaw merger? I'm just wondering what the holdup is in terms of a decision from yourself.
Well, I would say, first of all, let me say, just for the benefit of those who are watching, I've been very clear from the get-go that I will not allow the wholesale transfer of licenses from Shaw to Rogers. To your question, when I have an actual proposal on my desk for decision, we'll take a decision at that time. Now, as you know, the matter is in front of the court. The Competition Bureau has raised a number of issues, which we're following carefully. But until the time that I have something which is formally submitted to my department, I've been expressing a number of times what matters to me, which is affordability, competition in the market, and I'll keep repeating that so that everyone understands that.
Okay. Now, to be fair, you are correct by this was an individual company error. But to my point over this is an essential service that needs greater regulatory respect and powers to whoever sits in that seat, I still think is valid. I mean, one of my first committee meetings for industry was dealing with Michael Sabia, who represented Bell at that time as a CEO, who didn't want to provide same pay for women with pay equity. I remember we had to fight to get the deferral accounts back, over $1 billion taken from $1 billion taken from Canadians, and Bell did want to provide that going to the court system. And it goes on and on with the Competition Bureau already noting unscrupulous practices. Why can't we look at an essential service like this and then just bring in like a Bill of Rights for Canadians? I implore you to at least investigate that to see whether that's a potential. I understand the security provision elements are improvements, but they still don't take the consumer and businesses that are affected. Even the people from ArriveCan couldn't even get into the country properly because of it. Is that serious?
Listen, MP Massey, you know me. I'm one who always cooperate with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. As said, the immediate action I took within hours were first steps. I did not exclude anything. I'm happy to listen to this committee and the recommendation. I think also one thing that we can work together is the new CRTC policy direction. I think this is also some have called that historic in changing the nature of what matters to this government, and I would say to Canadians largely, which is competition, affordability. So listen, I have been very tough on the telecom companies because this was warranted. Like I said, they listened to me when I've demanded that no one was suggesting otherwise. They said, Minister, we will do exactly what you want within the timeline. But to your point, could there be additional steps taken in terms of what powers would be needed in addition to Bill C-26? I'd be happy to look at what this committee can recommend, and certainly we'll look at that.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. La parole est à Monsieur Deltel pour 5 minutes.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Deltel, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. You talked about the action you took about July 8th and following. You were in Tokyo and you made calls. Now, there was already an event that happened, not as serious a one in July, but in April in 2021. Hundreds of thousands of people in Ontario were affected by a Rogers outage. And there were major impacts. Each Canadian citizen who was impacted had to relive this situation 15 months later. What has your government done since April 19th, 2021 to avoid another unfortunate situation? What has your government done? Well, first of all, Mr. Deltel, thank you for your question. Well, we're talking about an outage of a different magnitude. I was very clear when I talked to the CEO of Rogers. I said it was unacceptable. We said we need three things to have more resiliency in our telecom networks. First of all, we wanted to exclude Huawei. The second is Bill C-26. And what I said earlier is this will do two things. It will give us additional powers in terms of cybersecurity, and also, and this is important for the committee, it will give the minister additional powers, because right now security is not one of the objectives in the Telecommunications Act. And new directives at the CRTC, where resiliency is discussed, we will be working to do more. Well, these three actions have changed nothing. Canadians suffered a second time in a period of 15 months because you didn't shake Rogers' cage before. You said I was very direct. I talked directly to these CEOs. Why didn't you do that 15 months ago? Well, if there was a negligence, Mr. Deltel, you'd have to ask Rogers as well, because it was Rogers who was negligent. Please, one moment. I represent Canadians. When I speak, I express the frustration of 12 million Canadians. I expressed the frustration of hundreds of thousands of businesses. But if you're talking about fault or negligence, you'll have the CEO of Rogers who will have to explain why this happened. But when it happened April 19th, 2021, why weren't you as proactive as you were this time? I understand more people were affected, but the same thing happened twice. Now, I know you were very proactive in 2022, but the problem is that something similar happened, a lesser impact, but the same problem happened 15 months before the event of 2022. Why weren't you as proactive? Because 15 months ago, we had the same problem. Well, Mr. Deltel, as you said, we're not talking about the same problem of the same magnitude. I hope you will put this question to the CEO of Rogers, because the fault is theirs. I know that you are an experienced MP. We're in solution mode. You have to be in solution mode as well today because Canadians expect that this committee, all of us, be in solution mode. There was an engagement that was broken, an undertaking that was broken on the part of Rogers, and I did what I had to do. Well, in 2021, one person in this in a company like this said we had to strengthen the mutual assistance possibilities among these companies. If we'd done so 15 months ago, we wouldn't have had this problem now. Why didn't you act then? Well, Mr. Deltel, look at what happened in the United States on July 6th. We went further than the United States. We're taking 3 measures. We're asking for concrete action immediately, and I would invite you to put these questions to the CEO of Rogers and ask him what's going to be done to make the network more resilient. Now, Ms. Lapointe. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. I know that when you met with Rogers, you asked that all the companies work together and come up with a plan, with an agreement. But it seems to me that the providers don't really want to work in a partnership because of reasons of competition. So how can we get them to go along? Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. Well, they have no choice. When I talked to them, I told them that they had no choice when they talked about it. I demanded that they come to a formal agreement on the 3 things. I talked about mutual assistance, emergency roaming, and protocols. This is only a beginning. After the CRTC investigation, we will have other recommendations, or there will be. But right now we're in solution mode. Well, what is really concerning here is that there are people who know that these are companies that, if they go down, can affect something like Interac, which affects the financial system. What can you do about that? Well, we can increase resiliency, and I asked the CEO. I talked to people at Interac, and we want to make sure there's more redundancies in the system. But our colleague, Mr. Deltel, as I said to Mr. Deltel, we have to put these questions to Rogers. We have to find out exactly what happened and what additional measures we need. We did take immediate measures following what happened in order to restore connectivity. But in order to be more resilient, I would hope the committee will deal with this, study this thoroughly, and also will have the recommendations of the CRTC. But we all want the same thing, a more resilient network. And that is what I demand from these various companies. They need a resilient, trustworthy system of telecommunications. Well, one of the questions I would ask Rogers is, and I'm asking you as well, is there an action plan to communicate with Canadians? Well, there should be in 45 days. That's one of the things I asked these companies to do. But what you're talking about is the frustration of Canadians, 12 million Canadians, who did not get the information they wanted, they needed during this outage. And also there was no emergency roaming, as our friends in the United States want. But there also has to be a very clear communications protocol. There has to be this protocol in place so that citizens can get the information they need. And we have to be able to support these companies if something like this happened again. Well, you shared the first stages of what you will do. But what about in future? Well, thank you for the question. The next stage is to see is the CRTC will launch an inquest, an investigation. It will come up with recommendations. I will take those recommendations and see what more I can demand of these companies. And that will be the next step. There will be measures that have to be put into place, then the CRTC investigation, then the recommendations, and then I imagine additional measures to ensure resiliency. You may have recommendations here in this committee, and I will look at them very attentively. Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. Mr. Minister, this concludes this part of our committee meeting. Thank you for being available. We will now suspend for 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues, for having allowed me to speak to you. Colleagues, please take your seats. We will be continuing our committee.
Standing Committee on Industry and Technology, which is pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Friday, July 15, 2022, for this committee to shed some light on the Rogers Communications Service outages in early July. So without further ado, we have with us here today Mr. Tony Staffieri, President and Chief Executive Officer of Rogers, ainsi que Monsieur Ron McKenzie, Chief...
As well as Ron McKenzie.
...d'être avec nous aujourd'hui au comité.
Thank you for being here today, and without further ado, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to be with you. My name is Tony Staffieri, and I am President and CEO of Rogers Communications. I am joined today by our new Chief Technology Officer, Ron McKenzie. I appear before you today because as Rogers CEO, I'm accountable for the outage that occurred on July 8th. I'm also responsible for the specific actions we are taking as a company to make sure this does not happen again. On that day, we failed to deliver on our promise to be Canada's most reliable network. More than a marketing slogan, we know just how critical the wireless phone and internet services Rogers provides are. Canadians need to be able to reach their families. Businesses need to be able to accept payments. And most importantly, emergency calls to 911 simply have to work every time. To those who are impacted by our outage, I am sorry. Today, I want to share with you how we are working to win back the trust and confidence of Canadians. I will start with what happened and why there was a delay in restoring our service. I'll discuss the important steps we're taking to help prevent this from happening again. And I'll conclude with some of the steps we have begun to take to make things better for our customers. Simply put, this outage was a result of a system failure following an update in our core network. Given the enormous complexity of all modern networks, understanding what caused the outage took some time. Once the cause was identified, our technical experts needed more time to methodically bring traffic back up as we had millions of customers trying to access their phones, home TV, and internet all at about the same time. To manage those returning traffic volumes, we had to physically disconnect the impacted equipment. Throughout this process, we had one singular and overriding focus: to get our customers up and running as quickly as we possibly could. And I understand the frustration our customers felt, not knowing when our networks would be back online. I wanted a timeline. But the fact is, we did not have one and didn't want to provide an estimate that might turn out to be wrong. In the conversations I've had with customers and with small and large business owners, there's one thing everybody wants to know. What is Rogers doing? Today, now. to learn from this outage and ensure it won't happen again. I've said we will make every investment needed to do our best to make sure that won't happen. That investment begins with the work now underway through our enhanced reliability plan. Working with the government and our competitors, we are making significant progress on a formal agreement to ensure that 911 calls can always be made, even in the event of an outage on any carrier's network. Making this a reality is the only responsible way forward, and I am personally committed to making it possible for all Canadians. I would like to thank Minister Champagne for his leadership on this. When it comes to our network, we will do our part and then some. To guard against a system-wide outage, we will set a higher standard by physically separating our wireless and internet networks and create an always-on network. To be frank, this added layer of protection will be expensive. We estimate it will cost at least $250 million, but we know it is the right thing to do. We will also continue with our plan to invest heavily in reliability. We will spend over $10 billion over the next few years to build out and strengthen our network. This investment includes additional oversight, more testing, and greater use of artificial intelligence to ensure upgrades we make to our network work as intended. Finally, we have partnered with leading technology firms to do a full review of our network systems to learn from the outage and emerge stronger. When this work is complete, we will share the key lessons with our competitors and other industry partners. When it comes to making things better for those who were impacted by our outage, we have already extended 5 days of credit for every Rogers customer. As well, we are working with our business customers to better understand the implications of the outage on their organizations. Chair, I know that it is only through our actions and with time that we can restore Canadians' confidence in us. We can and we will do better. I thank the committee for inviting us to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So we'll now move to the first round of questions with MP Michael Cram for 6 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the representatives from Rogers for joining us today at the committee. I was wondering if either you could describe for the committee the quality assurance practices that Rogers has in place for major software or hardware updates.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cram, we have extensive policies and procedures, and I'll have my colleague walk through some of those. But I can assure you that not only have they been extensive, but we continue to upgrade those continually. Network resiliency and redundancy is extremely important to us and in our industry.
This was an unprecedented impact to what's called the core of the network. And the core of the network you can think of as the brain of the network that controls all access of flow of information and flow of connectivity for all services to the internet. We have extensive, in this particular program, over 2 years in this program in particular, with full rigor, full review, full analysis that was done. This was the implementation was part of a 7-stage program, and this was stage 6. The previous 5, no issue whatsoever. So this was truly an unprecedented incident. We have very thorough reviews, very thorough simulations, very thorough testing, but this was an unprecedented incident.
And so does Rogers have a testing environment in place where you test updates before releasing them into the live production environment?
That's correct. We do. We do extensive both simulation testing. We also rely heavily side by side with the equipment vendors that work with us. So as we design and as we test, the equipment vendors work right alongside us because they provide the same infrastructure to all operators around the world. And so we also gain the benefit of the learnings of all other operators in terms of how they've executed and how they implement.
So then I guess the questions that have to be asked are, why was the root cause of this month's outage not caught in the testing environment? And also, why was the root cause of the April 2021 outage not caught in the testing environment as well?
Let me speak to, first of all, the events are very, very different. Let me speak to the event of July the 8th. The way to characterize, there was no way for the engineer at the time, when it had been performed 5 times prior with no incident whatsoever. There was no belief at the time, no information at the time that there was going to be any issue. And what happened was, when the code change was executed and the filter removed, the behavior of the equipment in the way it's designed between one vendor and a second vendor is very different. And that was the unknown at the time, of the behavior of one device, one manufacturer, who executes a standard one way versus another manufacturer. And so it was that sequence that caused essentially the event to then flood the core network.
And the April 2021 outage?
The April 21 outage was a software update performed by our partner, and the software update in that instance was tested, but the nature of the way it was deployed caused the impact. So that was done by our vendor. It was tested. It had been deployed in other networks around the world, and it was an instance that particular dynamic of the way it was deployed caused the incident back in April of 21.
Okay, I do have limited time in my questions, and I don't think we're going to get to the actual line of code in 5 minutes of committee work. But if Rogers could submit a document of a more technical nature to the committee, I would certainly find that helpful.
Yeah, what we've tried to do is, in our disclosure to the questions from the CRTC, we have been totally transparent in explaining, because what's so important from this is not just Rogers. This core design of a common IP core is the consistent architecture used by operators all around the world. We all use the same equipment. And so one of the learnings from this is to share that information with other operators around the world, including our competitors, who we've already been in discussions with, because this was an unprecedented event of the way 2 elements of equipment interacted together that was not known. And so in that instance, we do not want this incident to ever happen again with any other operator anywhere in the world.
All right. We had the minister at the committee right before you arrived, and he spoke about the CRTC doing an investigation as to what went wrong with this particular outage. Can you speak about the role that the CRTC can play in preventing future incidents like this happening again?
We will and will continue to cooperate with all levels of government and provide complete transparency on this incident. As you can appreciate, networks today are extremely complex, and we will do everything that's available to us in terms of investment in resources, working with leading firms around the world to make sure that we put in the resiliency and the redundancy that we need to make sure this does not happen again. And we've talked about our plans, which I'll describe very generally, and my colleague will go through the details of which, but they're really on 4 main points. The first is physically separating our wireless and wireline networks, so if one were to go down in the future, we could switch over to the alternate. The second is to what we describe as partitioning our network. So if an incident happens in one specific location, we contain that problem to that specific location. The third are changes we'll make to our processes and procedures in reviewing and implementing code, including the testing of it. And then finally, we are working on the Memorandum of Understanding with Minister Champagne's office that will allow us to more effectively work with our competitors, so that in the event of an emergency and an outage, we can transfer over calls, but most importantly, that we can ensure that 911 calls, every single 911 call, transfers over to an alternate network.
Merci beaucoup. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur Erskine.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Erskine Smith.
Thanks very much. I want to start with something you said, Mr. Staffieri, in relation to just how critical the services you provide are. And you said to reach families, businesses accepting payments, obviously 911 calls you referenced a number of times. Government services in some cases weren't fully available, and I point to IRCC as an example. Would you agree that the services you provide are an essential service in this regard?
We fully appreciate the reliance that Canadians have on our network and the networks of our industry, and we take that responsibility seriously. And that's why we focus very much, not just on this outage, but how do we fix this going forward? And I've articulated the steps we're going to take to ensure that we prevent this from happening again.
I appreciate that, and we all want to make sure it doesn't happen again. But it's also, I think, when you take a step back and reflect on what's happened here, there was a great frustration and anger, and rightly so, for millions of Canadians. But I think there are two critical lessons learned, lessons that we need to relearn in some ways. And one is the nature of the service that you provide. And that's what I want to just drive at first and see if there's a proper acknowledgement. Different private companies deliver different services, but you are unique insofar as you're a private company that is providing an important public essential service. Do you think that's right?
We do provide connectivity to millions of customers, and to the extent that some of our enterprise and business customers have customers that rely on them, then we have a role to play in that. And so in many respects...
Okay, I think that's as close to a yes as I'm likely to get, so I'll take that. We heard Minister Champagne refer to the incident and compare it to an airline incident. And airlines, as you know, like your industry, are oligopolies. They're tightly regulated, and they are essential for Canadians. And in that setting, and my colleague Brian Massey had referenced this earlier, but in that setting, if something like this were to happen, it wouldn't be that the company would of its own volition say it's going to be 2 days or 5 days or 7 days compensation. There would be obligations for a certain compensation. Do you think there ought to be a regulatory framework and a legal framework that it shouldn't be up to you to decide what to compensate Canadians, but it should be up to the law?
As I said, we take our role extremely seriously. First and foremost, as I spoke to our customers, including businesses large and small, the number one priority is how do they get assurance that this will not happen again? And that's our focus, first and foremost. Second is the compensation.
But surely that would be in clear and ready focus if there were obvious consequences to not taking these steps, right? I want to get to the lack of consequences in some ways. I appreciate you've identified compensation. I appreciate you've articulated a way forward to ensure it doesn't happen again. But you've also acknowledged, and I'm just going to read this from your answer to the CRTC, and I think you reiterated this today, but we failed in our commitment to be Canada's most reliable network. Okay, so say I'm a frustrated consumer. We have a lack of competition in this country, so where do I go?
What we've done is, as I said, made it clear what our commitment is to fix this moving forward for us as a company and improve as an industry. In terms of compensation, our outage lasted a little less than a day, but we had some customers that extended for a few days following. And so we made the decision to make it simple for customers and extended the credit to a full 5 days. We're going to proactively process those on customers' bills. So as I said, we make it easy for the customer, and that equates to approximately just over 15% of the customer's bill.
Let me return to this question of competition, because at this committee we continue to come back to this question, but it's always been around price and this frustration that when we look to how much Canadians pay in comparison to other countries, it is a great source of consternation for me and other members of this committee, I think, across all parties. But the other lesson that we've learned from this outage is that the lack of competition not only means that Canadians are suffering as it relates to price, but that it also means that the resilience of the network is challenged. And so, when we get to this idea of opening up networks from competitors to your customers in the context of an outage, you told the CRTC no competitors' networks would have been able to handle the extra and sudden volume of wireless customers, over 10 million customers, and the related voice data traffic surge. So isn't the concentration of not only the sector, but let's say your company in particular, isn't the concentration of customers in one particular company a challenge to resilience in and of itself?
There are two parts to your question, sir, and I'll start with the first being what I would describe as the technical solution and the ability to ensure and work as an industry so that there's reliability and redundancy for Canadians. The first part of your question relates to the competitiveness of the industry. We work every day in a very competitive environment, and we work hard to bring the best value for money for our customers and for Canadians. It's in our interest to do so. They have alternative and they have choice.
Wait, you think Canadians have alternative and choice in this marketplace?
Very much so.
And you're saying that with a straight face? Okay, I'm running out of time, so here's another one you can maybe answer with a straight face. Do you think this is the end of the Rogers-Shaw deal?
The coming together with Shaw is about creating scale in an industry where scale is important. It allows us to do two important things. One is make investments that neither one of us could do on our own. Investing more internet in rural and Indigenous communities, but also to invest in the resiliency and redundancy of networks more than either one of us could do alone.
Or perhaps to further concentrate industry whose very concentration is undermining resiliency and affordability for Canadians. I'm out of time, but I appreciate you being here today.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Erskine-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. And now, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for speaking with humility and without complacency. I find this very refreshing. We don't always hear this same kind of attitude. In the present context, what about your governance? Is there a problem?
Try again, sir.
Ça sera pas bien long. On va juste s'assurer que la traduction.
We just want to make sure that you're getting interpretation. So, clerk, can you hear me now? Or are you getting the interpretation? Should I start from the beginning? So, thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for appearing. I admire your attitude. I find it very refreshing that you have come here with humility and without complacency. You show a real sense of responsibility. So I think this is a good beginning in this context to restore confidence in the short and long term. Now, I have a question about Rogers' governance, which is controlled essentially by you, sir. We know that last year, almost all of Rogers' board was dismissed and that the business went through 15 months again, an outage. And I don't know if the same responsibility was shown then as has been shown in July. You had your CTO, whom you held responsible for this, but now you're responsible for this infrastructure. What do you intend to do about the infrastructure in the short and long term?
Thank you for your question, sir, and again through you, Mr. Chair. A few things that you touched on. Since becoming the CEO of this company early this year, my focus has been on a number of things, but importantly, the network. Network resiliency is very important, and the amount of investment that we have made in the network is significantly more than we would have done in prior years, and will continue to do more. The outage has shown us that it's critical that we make those investments. We want to make those changes quickly. There are things we know we need to do and that we learned from the outage, and so we acted very quickly. I have full confidence in our new Chief Technology Officer, Ron McKenzie, to execute on those changes. Ron is an engineer by background, has over 30 years of telecom experience at a very senior level. Most recently, he was president of our business operations, where he led the design and implementation of complex technical solutions for our customers. And I have full confidence that he and his team will execute on the changes that we need to do to achieve what we need to do in terms of network performance.
Dans la réponse que vous avez fournie
in the answer you sent to the Competition Bureau, you talked about an increased efficiency, which would make up for the harm to clients, and that there would be greater redundancy. Now, past events, what have they led to? Can people now trust in you? And especially since the Rogers-Shaw merger would entail a lot of expenditures.
As I've mentioned, the coming together with Shaw was about giving us scale and making the necessary investments. As part of our proposed merger with them, we will be selling Freedom Mobile and have an agreement with Quebecor to purchase those assets. And we believe that will create a very important and stronger fourth competitor for the wireless industry in the Canadian marketplace. That acquisition will allow them to serve over 87% of the Canadian population in at least 4 provinces. And we think that's significant. In terms of redundancy and reliability, which is the topic today, the coming together with Shaw will give us the ability to provide an alternate network. Our intent is to keep the Shaw cable network as independent, and we will have our wireline cable network become part of that and be completely separate from our wireless network. And so in terms of our plan, the Shaw transaction will allow us to execute on that ability to separate those in half the time than it otherwise would.
Vous avez mentionné que la priorité.
You mentioned that the priority was to conclude this merger. Now, you're dealing with a company that is heavily indebted. We know the transaction would be about $26 billion. Will you be spending hundreds of millions more to make sure that the network is more robust and that there won't be further outages?
In planning for our coming together with Shaw, we were very careful in looking at the complete financial picture as well as the benefits it would provide to all stakeholders. And I can confirm to you, sir, that our plans are that we can conclude the transaction and increase the amount of investment that we intend to make in infrastructure and in networks. Networks are the lifeblood of our industry. In our 60 years of entrepreneurial history, it's always been about the network, the wireless network as well as our cable wireline network, and that will continue to be our priority.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Now, Mr. Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. To be fair, this committee has had to pass actually pushed hard to get some witnesses to come, so I'm glad you've come on your own volition. However, I do want to make sure, though, here that I understand what is being proposed. Did I hear correctly in terms of the separation of the lines to make sure that 911 would work is around $250 million. So is that specifically what is required to ensure that 911 does not fail again? That's one of the largest problems in all of this. I mean, there's one thing of inconveniences, but second to that, 911 is critical. So is that correct? Is it's a $250 million is the fix for the 911?
If I could clarify, as part of the investments and the fixes we're putting in place, first and foremost, emergency 911 and essential services is core to what we're doing, and as part of the memorandum of understanding that we will deliver together with our industry in the next 60 days, we have been working on and will deliver a robust solution for 911 so it works. What we saw in the outage was that our planned solution as an industry failed. Many calls.
So it's not a. Sorry, go ahead.
Many calls did go through, but many did not. And even one is too many. And so as part of the fixes, we will have the redundancy that I spoke about. But in addition to that, we will have failover measures so that in the event that there is an outage and it doesn't fall over to our alternate network, it will fall over to one of our competitors' network within seconds. And we're working with
sorry, I just want to I just make sure that I get this correct. So it's not a technical problem in terms of providing 911 guarantee service. It's more of was a business decision that led to the lack of capacity or redundancy in the system.
The failure of 911 calls was a technical problem. It had nothing to do with lack of resources. We clearly prioritize emergency calls. The specific technical problem, and I'll ask my colleague to provide a fuller explanation, but what happens is when there's an outage, certain phones would continue to try to connect to our network even though the network was down. And that's the frustration that we incurred.
Yeah, and I don't need a technical answer for that. I appreciate it, but that's what I'm looking for. It was a business decision at the end of the day, and it's a business decision to fix this. I mean, that's the critical. Would you, and Mr. Erskine-Smith mentioned about essential services. Would you categorize that any provider in our system providing 911 is essential?
There's nothing more important than the completion of 911 calls, and the inability for calls on 911 to complete on July 8th was a technical issue. It was not for a lack of resources. There was no business decision other than the one to confirm that 911 calls are important and we need to ensure that they be able to be made.
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, it's a business decision because there wasn't the provision of cash. It's either one of two things. It's either a technical problem that we have to disguise as a committee if we're actually letting our carriers do that, or we're letting them make decisions that don't prioritize it enough to actually have the redundancy. And that's the follow-up that I think that is necessary to find out to make sure. You had this problem before, and there was promises to fix it. What happened between that time back in 2021 into today? That's where I think that their consumer confidence has to be reasserted for the business application aspect. I think we might have to separate the 911 for this committee myself. But what happened between then and now? What's different? And why didn't that fix from 2021 get done for this situation?
I'll commence. The outage that occurred last April on our wireless services was due to a specific technical issue that was different than the one we encountered on July 8th. Following the April outage, changes were made to our network, to our processes, to prevent that type of outage and other outages. But we just could not foresee the type of outage that we experienced on July 8th.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, the instances are very different. The instance on July 8th was essentially the core of the network, the brain of the network that supports all wireless, wireline, internal communications, and connectivity. It was a complete loss of connection. So the technical issue on the 911, as much as our fellow operators all offer to help, there is no technical way with loss of connectivity. And we wish we could have helped because we wish we could have transferred.
Thank you. I'm going to have one quick question left, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it is important when I wanted to get in. Is that part of the problem we have right now is that we're still, whether it's the minister, nobody in your organization thought to call the minister. even with 911 down. Now you're just kind of making up stuff like in terms of what to do next for consumers and things like that. It's not a negative comment. Same with the minister. He's making up some new things in terms of regulatory and processes. Would Rogers support a universal, I guess, process that's transparent for consumers, businesses, and the public for all carriers? So that there would be like a bill of rights for consumers and carriers all alike. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting in the seat or somebody else in the future. Is that something Rogers would support?
We are very much focused on what we need to do to ensure the resiliency and redundancy of our networks so we can earn back in this competitive environment the confidence and trust of our customers and of Canadians. We will make the investments needed to make this right.
Thank you. That's all the time we have, Mr. Massé, but we'll get back to you.
Thank you.
And now we'll move to Mr. Généreux for 5 minutes.
Président, merci.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Staffieri and Mr. McKenzie. You have customers in Quebec, or at least indirectly, because I was affected by the outage. I couldn't use Interac services. Was the Quebec government informed quickly, or at least the minister? No, I believe the minister called you. Did you inform the Quebec government of these issues?
Again, through you, Mr. Chair, sir, throughout the day, beginning in late morning, once we knew and had access to our networks, which was a little after 10:30, we started the communication. What we knew stakeholders wanted to know was what was the cause of the outage, and in particular, was this a cyber security incident? And when did we expect the networks to get up? And you could imagine us focusing on those two issues first and foremost. We notified the minister's office shortly before noon of our outage and that we did not have the answers to those two questions. I spoke with the minister in the early evening. To answer your specific question, we did not notify the Premier of Quebec until that evening as well. And in retrospect, I regret that. And I'm disappointed that we didn't reach out sooner. There are reasons, as I said, we were focused on the solution and getting our customers up and running. But nonetheless, those communications should have happened sooner for an important stakeholder such as the government.
Est-ce que je dois comprendre que malgré...
Am I to understand, and you talked about 250 million for a fix for 911 and then 10 billion in the entire, throughout the entire system. These services you offer have a real influence, a real impact on human lives. People can call 911 through your services. So you're saying today we're going to invest 250 million and more than 10 billion eventually. Will these investments, or should these investments have already been made to ensure the quality of the services you offer?
Today, we invest close to $3 billion every year. This year, we will invest $3 billion, and that number has continued to grow. Of that $3 billion investment we make every year, this year, more of that goes to the network than would have been the case in the past. Network investment this year will be double what it was 2 years ago, and as we look to future years, as that capital investment continues to grow, more and more of that proportionately will be spent on networks, and the $250 million is the immediate incremental investment we will make in what I would describe as urgent fixes to the redundancy and resiliency of our network.
Quelle est la relation d'affaires vous avez avec...
What is the business relationship you have with Interac? For those listening to us, I'd like to know. I myself could use Interac. I used my credit card instead. What is the business relationship you have with Interac? Because this affects customers who aren't necessarily your customers.
I'll start, and Ron can complement. Interac is a customer of ours, and we provide connectivity to Interac across the nation. And in our relationship with Interac, we were responsible for providing primary and secondary. And that primary and secondary connectivity was through our wireless and our wireline network. Because this outage impacted our core gateways, as my colleague outlined, it caused both to go down. And so as a result, we failed Interac and we failed Canadians.
OK, rapidement.
Oui, très rapidement,
Juste une petite question.
Yes, briefly. Do you have any French Canadians on your board? Or women, Anglophone or Francophone, on your board?
Ce serait intéressant que vous...
If you don't, that might be something you could look into.
Thank you for the comment, and board decisions are made by the board, and I will refer those comments to our board.
Merci beaucoup. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Madame Lapointe.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Lapointe for 5 minutes.
It's difficult to understand how a scheduled upgrade could cause such a massive failure of Rogers' network. And normally one would expect that the upgrade would have been tested extensively and deployed in a sandboxed test environment. And in fact, Mr. McKenzie indicated this was done when he was responding to MP Cram. So I want to dive a little deeper and ask, did you use both Cisco and Juniper in the sandbox test, or only one of those manufacturers' products? And how will you ensure future sandbox testing will have greater rigor and resilience?
I'll start with two broad comments. And one is pre-testing of certain changes where practical is always done. In certain cases, it's impractical. And what you saw here was an outage that made its way throughout the entire network. And so it's difficult to have a test environment that replicates the entirety of a very complex network across the nation. And that's why in this case, we would have been unable to test this in what we would call a lab environment.
It's very difficult to simulate a live, full environment. It can be parts. In this case, because this was the 6th time, and the previous 5 times, there was never an indication that there was any issue. This was a very unique case in the way one particular manufacturer designed their system and how it handles flow control and traffic, and the way it went into one mode flooded because the other handles traffic in a very different fashion. So and it was that within minutes.
Could the Canada-wide failure have been avoided with a staged regional deployment where you would have first deployed in some smaller regional networks and then expanded gradually across the country, like even over a few days if no issues were detected?
So all carriers, we all use and have for many years the concept of a common IP core. So the common IP core is what's at the root here. And a common IP core is designed for, obviously, security purposes. It lets you manage, and it lets you essentially, I would describe it as the brain of the network. And so it's not something that traditionally is regionalized. All operators use a common core and then use what's called access networks to feed into that. The access networks can be managed.
Thank you. I have limited time, so so I want to focus on what occurred during the 16-hour outage. And the question I have to ask is, does Rogers have a robust and tested emergency preparedness and disaster recovery plan? Because part of a disaster recovery process is regular communication with affected stakeholders. And this did not take place in this instance, or for that matter, last year's outage. even regular hourly messages indicating that Rogers was aware of the issue and working on to isolate and resolve the problem would have been better than the silence that we saw. And the second part of my question is Mr. Staffieri, when did you learn of the outage and why didn't you inform the public and the government?
In response to the first part of the question, we do have an emergency response team. And shortly after the incident occurred, that team, who's well prepared, pulled together the resources needed to go through a plan that is put in place well in advance of how to react to these types of situations. We were delayed in this instance because our own network had gone completely dark. Nonetheless, we quickly made arrangements for alternative connectivity, and that caused some delay. Notwithstanding that, in terms of communication, broadcast started as early as 5:30 in the morning that there was a network problem. We did not know fully until much later the full extent that it was a national outage. Once we knew, we communicated that on social media just before 9 a.m. and on radio stations. As I spoke to Canadians, customers afterwards, what they really wanted to know, and it's what we wanted to know, is what's the root cause and when's this going to be fixed? And we just didn't know the answer to that. We always strive to be extremely transparent with customers and Canadians and share as much information as we knew, but we just didn't know the answer to those questions. And so as we got more information, we shared that publicly. We did not know until late afternoon that we had a fix that was going to allow the network to come back up. And once we knew that, then we promptly communicated that through all the relevant media channels.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Madame Lapointe. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes.
Now, Mr. Lemire, for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. My question is, what kind of crisis unit did you have? There would have been your CTO at the time, Mr. Fernandez. Was he part of your crisis cell or crisis unit?
In terms of our emergency response plan, we bring to bear, depending on the type of emergency, all the right resources, including me and whoever is responsible. So you can imagine every one of these has the full attention of the organization. And certainly on this outage, Mr. Fernandez, who was our CTO, was immediately notified at just before 5 a.m. and was very much integral to the recovery plans and investigation of what went on that day, together with the rest of the network team. We have several command centers issued throughout the country, and the outage happened just before 5 a.m. By 5:30, teams were already pulled together to start to work on the problem.
Merci. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez?
Thank you. What do you think of the solution imposed by Minister Champagne, which means to rely on your competitors in order to have a backup?
Minister Champagne's initiative to have the industry work collaboratively in a very formal document is going to be very constructive to a redundancy and resiliency program. As I've mentioned, we've made very good progress on moving that forward, so we will have it completed within the 60-day time frame. And importantly, it'll provide for failover measures in the event that one network goes down. Importantly, for 911, so that there is a robust plan to ensure that every single call transfers over. And then finally, communication protocols, so that the minister and other important government agencies are alerted as quickly as possible about any future outages.
Donc, vous seriez...
So, you would cooperate with your competitors in the event of a similar issue, similar problem?
We would very much cooperate with our competitors, and in these types of situations, there is always collaboration with our competitors in order to obtain a fix. One of the calls I received early on was from the CEOs of the other telecom operators asking how they could help. And so there's always been that type of collaboration and cooperation. It's in our interest as an industry for all Canadians to ensure we recover quickly. But as you heard earlier, for technical reasons, we were unable to transfer over our traffic volume to our competitors' networks.
Merci. Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Massey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And following up with Mr. Lemire's questioning is the interesting aspect of this is that without, I guess, any type of an essential service bill of rights or something along that nature, so we have to rely upon private meetings amongst the CEOs and the boards in private meetings with the minister to find a solution. So that really what's being presented here is that we rely on that and you guys come back to us later on after you had those private meetings, and what transparency is there for Canadians? I mean, this sounds like something that really is not going to build the trust I think is necessary.
Throughout this process, we have been as transparent as we can be. And if you're to look at some of the filing we have made, including most recently the CRTC filing, we want to share all the information on this outage. It only makes our industry better and more prepared for this to happen in the future. As part of this agreement with our competitors on this memorandum of understanding, we look forward to being very transparent on how, because the Canadians deserve to know how the industry is going to ensure that this does not happen again at this scale.
Well, I guess I hesitate because I've seen this show before when we have a few industry players together and meeting in private where there's no public access to any of those meetings. The minister can follow up, but the minister won't be able to provide documents or doesn't have to, even to Parliament or this committee. So I fail to see how this process is going to build public trust. I think that the other carriers that are going to be involved in this are probably going to get their reputations as well brought into this because, quite frankly, it's what's happened is that either through public negligence, through Parliament and their processes that we've had here, or through the industry itself, is that we have failed collectively on 911, something that was supposed to be guaranteed. So I'll finish with this, Mr. Chair, is that I don't think this process is going to satisfy the public because those meetings will not be public. There'll be heavy redacted materials. We'll have to go to access to information to find out what is going to go on for even scheduling and so forth. So I'm worried about it at this point in time, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. Now, Ms. Gray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. So we learned that your core system going down also included 911 going down, but as well, there were 4 emergency alerts that did not work. 1 dangerous person alert by the RCMP, and 3 Environment Canada tornado warnings. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of all the specific messages that didn't go out, but as I've said, it's unacceptable that even a single emergency message did not go out, and that's what we're focused on correcting.
Okay. Did you have protocols and processes in place should an outage like what occurred so that critical services like 911 and emergency alerts were still operating?
We had procedures in place to ensure that 911 and emergency essential services would switch over to an alternate carrier's network for very specific technical reasons. That automatic transfer did not happen.
So in the submission that you made to the CRTC answering questions, it said, well, considering many times during the day shutting down it would have been the radio access network, this simply was not a solution. So that's correct? Is that what you're referring to?
That's correct. Let me outline a few principles. Shutting down our radio access network, or the RAN as it's commonly referred to, is not a significant decision. To be able to shut down the RAN, you need to have access to the network, and when our network went down, it was dark until approximately 10:30 a.m. So the earliest we could consider the RAN was after the RAN shutdown was after 10:30.
Okay.
And so we considered that option. If I could finish, we considered that option, but by that point we had already started to see areas where our network started to come back on. And so we decided not to shut off the RAN. Had we done that, it would have, in all likelihood, extended the outage for at least another day. And so that was a significant decision that needed to be made. And we took the view that given we were seeing opportunities to get our network up and running sooner, we made the decision to not shut down the RAN.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, it sounds like as you were considering different options, that there weren't strict protocols actually in place considering what happened. So that's not overly reassuring to the public. A few other questions here for you. What is Rogers' annual revenue in 2021?
All of our figures are publicly disclosed.
Okay. How many staff approximately do you have?
We have a team of approximately 25,000 employees throughout Canada.
And approximately how many customers would you have?
We have over 12 million customers across the nation.
Does Rogers have a chief risk officer or a chief risk management officer?
We have a risk officer, and it reports into our audit and risk committee. And as part of the processes and reviews, there are very specific areas that they focus on in identifying potential risks, and network and cyber would rank as amongst the most important risk a company like ours face. And so therefore we have very specific emergency recovery procedures in the event that an incident like this happens.
Is that person in your executive? Are they in the executive role as a chief risk officer?
They are part of the chief financial officer's accountability and responsibility. It's a senior level within our company.
Okay. Well, many organizations that are far less complex and large actually have this senior type position, a CRO, in their organization. So why have you not hired or brought someone into that senior CRO position at Rogers?
We are confident that through the processes we have today, we have a very methodical and encompassing approach to ensuring that we identify risks and we have the proper plans in place to manage, mitigate, and deal with any exposures that come out of that risk.
Well, obviously the results of the outage that occurred in July of this year speaks differently than what you just said. So you've had two system-wide failures within your organization, created by your organization, putting public safety at risk. So who are losing their jobs, or should it be you? Do you have confidence of your board?
I'm accountable to ensure this doesn't happen again. And as I've said, we have already undertaken processes and actions to make changes so that we quickly move forward with the plans that are articulated to ensure this does not happen again.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Mr. Dong for the last round of questions.
Chair, I'll see my time to Mr. Equinder to ask the questions.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank the individuals from Rogers for obviously making time for this committee. My question is for Mr. Staffieri, and I can already predict the response for this question, but it's the question that I asked the minister. There are experts that now argue that telecommunications networks should be considered public utilities because of the nature of the service, that it's a critical digital infrastructure. So what do you think of that statement? Do you think that the service that your company provides is as important that it should be considered a public utility?
What I can tell you, sir, is that together with 25,000 employees throughout the country, we come to work every day with the view of trying to be better for our customers. And in this case, as I said, we let them down. We are going to make the changes. It's in our interest to do that in the environment we operate. As a competitive company in this industry, in this country, it's in our interest to do all the things we need to do to ensure this does not happen again.
Great, thank you for that. So as we know, when talking about compensation, payments couldn't occur, sales were missed, meetings were missed, work couldn't be done, and businesses couldn't operate fully. So the extent of damages are quite substantial. I know Rogers has committed to compensating customers for 5 days worth of services. So can you give the committee details about how you arrived at that 5-day credit as a suitable amount, and whether you actually think it's a suitable amount given the repercussions of this outage?
The outage lasted just under a day, and we immediately looked to a few things. And as I said, as I spoke to customers and Canadians, what they really want to know is, how do we ensure this doesn't happen going forward? And that's what we're focused on. In terms of the compensation, we wanted to do the right thing. The outage lasted a little less than a day. We initially made it 2 days of credit. What we found is once the network was up, there were still some customers that were experiencing some issues throughout different parts of the country. For an additional 1-2 days, we decided to just make it 5 days. We wanted to make it easy for customers. It's a full 5-day credit, and it will show up on their future bills. There's nothing that customers need to do in order to obtain that credit.
Great. I look forward to seeing an estimate of the cost of this outage on the Canadian economy. So my last question is that I know the minister met with all of you to talk about a collaboration on several items with other telecom providers. So can you update the committee on how the plan is coming along and what collaboration between the telecom companies will look like?
So we're working collaboratively as an industry on the Memorandum of Understanding, which will encompass 3 important areas. And the first is failover measures in the event of an outage and each of our preparedness for that. The second, and that's probably the most critical, is how do we ensure that 911 and emergency calls transfer over all the time without any failure at all. And the third is communication protocols. We've been working not only as an industry, but together with the Minister's Office and ISED to move this along, and it's our commitment to ensure that we conclude that within the 60-day time frame that the Minister outlined.
Great, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Gaïr.
Thank you. And this concludes our second and last round of questions. So I would like to thank Mr. Staffieri and Mr. McKenzie for making yourselves available. I'd like to thank the clerk, analysts, interpreters. And the committee will be continuing its work this afternoon